this election is going to stress test the safeguards that our founding fathers came up with to help the system navigate against crisis. The question is, are these safeguards still resilient enough to basically keep the system going?
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for February 19th through February 26th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 2023 1-ounce silver Britannia at $3.15 over spot with a minimum order of 50. We also have 1-ounce Gold Krugerrand at only $59 over spot. And finally, we're offering 1-ounce Platinum Valcambi bars at just $69 over spot. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with Liberty and Finance. And with us today, a new guest, David Woo, a former top Wall Street global macro strategist. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Elijah.
Well, one of the things that you're really good at is seeing trends that other people don't. So for 2024, for the economy and geopolitically, what are some things that people aren't paying attention to that you think they should?
I think, in general, I just want to say, I don't want to say I'm a contrarian, basically by nature. Maybe I am, I don't know. But I tend to look for, basically things that are not so obvious, because having worked on Wall Street for many years, in many ways, right, just think about this, right? Wall Street has Wall Street consensus. If you just follow the consensus, you're never going to make money. So from that point of view, if you want to actually beat the market consistently, you have to be prepared to contemplate the impossible by trying to basically, try to think very hard about what could possibly go wrong with the Wall Street consensus. At this moment, there's no doubt. The Wall Street consensus is that the U.S. economy is rocking, right? If you think about the data over the last few months, the U.S. economy has defied gravity. To a great extent, the second half of last year, literally, the economy just accelerated. And I think that caught many people by surprise. And as a result, now everybody thinks, oh, wow, listen, there's no stopping the U.S. economy. As a result, everybody's revising up their U.S. GDP growth forecast. As a result, the U.S. stock market keeps going higher. Market is no longer looking for aggressive rate cuts by the Fed and so on and so forth. So that's the consensus. The question is, of course, what could possibly be wrong with the consensus? And that's usually my starting point when I look at crowded positions, crowded investments, when everybody is basically saying the same thing. Then the question is, what could possibly go wrong? Now, my personal view is very simple. There's no denying the U.S. economy did very well in the second half of last year. The question, of course, is why? Was it due to temporary factors? Or was it basically due to, permanent factors that are sustainable into 2024? I think that this is the single most important question, because at the end of the day, the world's changing all the time. And very often, we're looking at temporary changes. Sometimes we're looking at permanent changes. We need to be able to differentiate between these two things. In fact, that's probably one of the most important lessons if you work on Wall Street. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that the strength of the U.S. economy in the second half of last year was due to two main factors. Okay. Factor number one was a collapse in gasoline price that we saw in the fourth quarter of last year. Just to put that in perspective, basically, if you look at gasoline price nationwide, average, gasoline price was at $3.80 at the end of September. And by the end of December, it was at $3. Okay. That's a drop of 25%. Now, you might say, well, what's 25%? 25% is an annualized rate, 100%. Let me tell you, that was a huge boost, to purchasing power of U.S. households. And as a result, U.S. household spending surged, basically in the fourth quarter. It had a lot to do with this particular, development, which in my view is not that sustainable into 2024, because for one thing, the reason for this drop in gasoline price, which is this massive surge in U.S. crude oil production, in my view, that is not sustainable. We saw basically production increasing by 1 million barrels per day in the final 3 months of last year, And in my view, that's not sustainable, especially given the fact if you look at actually rig counts, in the Permian region, for example, they're actually falling. They're even falling this week, by the way. And then you say, well, so what drove up oil production last year, U.S. oil production? Now, I'll tell you what I really think. I mean, we're talking about liberty in finance here. I actually think it was a bribery, okay? Because in September, ExxonMobil announced, a mega acquisition, okay? $65 billion to take over Pioneer, which is one of the largest shale producers. A few weeks later, Chevron announced a mega, basically, acquisition of Hess, another major, basically, U.S. oil producer. Now, both Chevron and Exxon know that they still need, basically, the blessing of the administration to get it done. And they also know the Biden administration's, has been under a lot of pressure from their own party, actually. There are a lot of Democrats who are against these mergers because they're wary that consolidation among the oil majors will only basically push up prices, okay, and hurt the consumers down the road. My humble opinion, again, I have a theory, and sometimes, in life you have a hypothesis, you cannot prove it, but my hypothesis is that Chevron and Exxon sent their lobbyists, got their lobbyists to send a message to the White House saying that, you know what, if you approve this deal, we're going to ramp up oil production like this tomorrow heading into the 2024 election. So I actually think that there's a lot to be said about basically this. And in my view, this is the reason why I'm not sure to what extent this surge in oil production is sustainable. I'm not saying, sure, right now we're at 13.3 million barrels per day in terms of U.S. production. I'm not saying it's going to go down. I just don't think it can go much higher. So from that point of view, I think oil price is going nowhere in a hurry. In fact, actually, with the geopolitical risk rising in the Middle East and so on and so forth, which we can talk about that separately, I think oil is going to be a headwind as opposed to a tailwind for the U.S. economy in 2024. Okay, a very, very different story. The second reason why the U.S. economy did so well in the second half of last year was because of a massive increase in U.S. government spending. I mean, let me put it this way to you. U.S. government spending growth accounted for almost a third of GDP growth in the second half of last year. In fact, if we were to take away government spending growth, GDP growth would have been normal, would have been like, 2% or something like that. Okay? Now you say, well, where did all this government spending come from? Guess what? Because if you remember, in 2001, 2020, 2021, 2022, a lot of money had been earmarked for COVID. And a lot of that money was not spent because COVID was over. Okay? And in a dash, because the Republicans were demanding that this money be basically given back to taxpayers. And the administration didn't want to. So they instructed the agency to go out and spend this money, okay, before they lose it. So every agency went out and spent money like there's no tomorrow, hiring people like crazy. Last year, in the second half of last year, U.S. government basically hiring accounted for nearly 30% of all hiring in the United States. In terms of new jobs created, was working for the U.S. government. So that is not sustainable either, because thanks to basically Mike Johnson, my personal hero, I actually think we have got one of the best speakers in the House for a very long time. I think he and his basically cohort are going to basically ensure that this does not happen again in 2024. I hope they shut down the government actually in March when basically the continuing resolution expires. But the point here is that instead of fiscal easing like we saw last year, we're probably going to see some fiscal tightening this year. I'm not saying very much, but definitely more than you think is coming. So the combination of, so I think that, the reason why the U.S. economy did so well the second half last year, I don't think is repeatable. So from that point of view, while everybody's getting so excited about U.S. growth, that kind of thing, I actually think it's time to actually fade this optimism and look to actually, essentially profit from a reversal of this optimism, which I think is right now currently my main focus in terms of my investment advice.
Now, when it comes to the stock market, it's making all-time highs, but it seems like you're saying the stock market has too much confidence in the economy right now.
Yeah, and I think, obviously this week, I don't know when this program will come out, but by which time I guess NVIDIA probably would have already released their Q4 earnings. And I think that's going to be the thing, right? Because if we could talk about the third factor that accounted for the strength of the U.S. economy last year, of course, was this massive, basically rally in the U.S. stock market that basically boosted, household wealth, right? And we know with positive wealth effect, people have more money, they're going to go on and spend a bit more money. And a big part of the equity rally, in fact, the biggest part of the equity rally, of course, was this whole AI story that basically emerged after the release of ChatGPT. Now, there is no doubt. I mean, that was the big story of 2023, right? Because the Magnificent Seven, which led the rally, was seen as basically potentially the biggest beneficiaries of basically AI, right? Wall Street is not, I don't think you're like Liberty in finance, but Wall Street is pretty cynical. Wall Street is pretty much decided the only people or entities are going to benefit from AI are going to be like these big tech monopolies, right? That's why the Magnificent Seven did so well, and everybody else actually didn't do that well. And then, however, even that rally of Magnificent Seven has starting to basically become more narrow, right? I mean, lately it's just been basically NVIDIA, Microsoft, and a little bit of Amazon. So we've gone from basically Magnificent Seven to now whatever the Three Musketeers. But the big one, of course, is NVIDIA. NVIDIA is coming out with its earnings this week. I mean, I personally think it's a great company, but at this point, it's very, very expensive. If market decides to, take some money off the table because NVIDIA can only basically meet expectation as opposed to beating it by another mile, I think that could potentially provide the sort of catalyst for more, basically a bigger equity sell-off. Because if the whole AI story, is priced in, that will be another drag for the U.S. economy, ironically, heading into this election year.
And mentioning the election, even now we're seeing a lot of polls coming out showing Trump ahead. So if we see a weak economy heading into the election, what does that mean for the outcome of the election this year?
Listen, I've been a big Trump supporter, okay, over the last how many years? I mean, in 2016, you can Google me, like one of my claims to fame was that I was the only Wall Street analyst who pounded the table in 2016 and said Trump was going to win and the dollar was going to take off and the U.S. economy was going to take off, and it did, okay? Now, it's not that I think Trump is amazing. I just think that his policies make a great deal of sense because I actually think that, Trump is a realist. And at the end of the day, you need a realist to actually navigate the U.S. through this very treacherous world right now, especially given the challenges that the U.S. basically faces. I mean, this is why I think Trump is the right guy. But let me put it this way. I think, the way I think about this, I think, obviously goes out saying if the election is to be held tomorrow, Trump is going to win, probably by a lot. And that's because all the polls, I don't care how Trump is polling or not polling in New York and California, because we know the U.S. system is an electoral college system, right? If you look at Trump's lead over Biden, okay, among the battleground states, from Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Trump is going to basically wipe the floor with basically Biden if an election is held tomorrow. However, the election is still 9 months away, and 9 months is a very long time. Not that I think that all of a sudden anything is going to change about what Trump is offering, but I think the uncertainty is about, okay, fine, if the Democrats, because right now, every day you got Democrats coming out, reasonable Democrats, even some rhinos coming out saying that, well, if Trump is elected, that will be the end of America. If Trump is elected, that will be the end of American democracy. If Trump is elected, we're going to have dictatorship in the U.S. You know what? This type of talk makes me extremely nervous. Okay, makes me extremely nervous. It's as though that they're preparing the public for very extreme measures. Now, I don't know what these extreme measures could be. Are they going to get rid of him in some way? If they cannot put him away in jail, are they going to come after his person? I think that we just saw this as, Navalny happened in Russia, but who knows? After what I've seen the last 4 years in the U.S., I don't think the U.S. from that point of view is any better than Russia, let's put it that way. Okay. And I think, this is because we live in a world in which people take their political ideologies much too seriously. Okay. And this is the reason why they see Trump as such a big threat. If he's such a big threat to the people who are in power, then you know what? They could very well decide to get rid of him. Now, that I see as the single biggest risk of 2024, which is something happens to Trump, that Trump somehow does not live to the election day. That will be a catastrophe, I think. Okay. I just hope that Trump does not appoint a VP running mate until literally a day before the election. Because as soon as he nominates a VP running mate, he becomes vulnerable. Because the other side might decide, well, if Trump has a VP running mate, we get rid of him, the VP running mate is going to basically move into, basically will be the top of the ticket. And then, things might come down because, so on and so forth. So I think this is why Trump actually has an incentive not to basically trying to hold off from announcing a VP, basically a candidate for as long as he can. But I do think that this is something that worries me. And I think, it's going to worry most Americans, by the way. I don't think I'm the only one, by the way. I mean, even Tucker Carlson has talked about possibility of Trump being assassinated. And I'm like, I've been saying this for a while, but now some reasonable people, including Tucker, if you consider him to be reasonable, are basically saying the same thing. Okay, I think a lot of Republicans, especially Trump supporters, sort of have that fear inside them, whether they're actually externalizing and verbalizing or not is a different story. But that is a fear. But why does that matter for the economy? Let's think about this. The Wall Street Journal published a big article last week. They send tens of journalists across the country interviewing people in the streets, cafes, restaurants to find out one very important question, which is if the economy is doing so well, why is consumer confidence so depressed? Okay. And what they discovered was this. And that was shocking. And I guess for some people, to me, I was not too shocked, which is that they found that many Americans basically saying that they are pessimistic because they are pessimistic about the political outlook as opposed to the economic outlook of the country. That they're worried about extreme political polarization and divisiveness, okay, and political instability. Now, one thing I do know is this, okay? I think as we get closer to the election, let's just say we're talking about, if I have to basically bet, you're talking the first quarter, second, third, and fourth quarter this year. If you ask me, which is going to be the worst quarter for U.S. GDP growth in 2024, I would say there's no question it's going to be the third quarter. Because the third quarter is going to be the final, basically, run up to the election. It's going to feel like shit, every single day. Okay, there will be, I think I like to say this, our founding fathers were amazing men. They happen to be men. That's a fact. They were amazing men because they created a lot of safeguards to basically to protect the U.S. system against a political crisis that's literally, in my view, basically underway, in 2024. And in Q3 this year, we're going to see a heavy stress testing of these safeguards. And I think that makes me very nervous. If for nothing else, I think the U.S. economy, U.S. consumers are going to pull back. I think corporations are going to pull back in terms of spending, or even for that matter, hiring. So as a result, I think Q3 is going to feel really bad. Okay, it might even come sooner. I don't know, but the point here is that that's the way you got to think about this. If you're an investor, let's just say, I don't even care, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, that kind of thing. If you want to think about how to trade and invest in this political cycle, okay, I think that's a reasonable, I just gave you a pretty good blueprint to think about the timing, because at the end of the day, investing is all about timing.
It is very interesting to see the interplay between politics and economics there. What I find quite surprising is that a lot of people, especially in the mainstream, are saying that Trump is a threat to democracy. But it seems like what you're saying is that actually the fight against Trump is the threat to democracy. So it's a bit ironic there. Can you expand on that?
Sure. I think, honestly, listen, I'm by now, I think it should be very clear. I'm more conservative, whatever that means. I actually think I'm quite mainstream. I think I like to think of myself as just being a practical guy, a realist, more than anything else, right? But I do think there's a big difference between the left and the right. And I'll tell you what that is. Okay. The main difference is that for the left, okay, basically the means, okay, any means is possible as long as it justify the ends. Okay. That is, if they have a certain goal in mind, they'll do whatever to basically achieve those goals because they think of their goals as being somehow have a moral status, a moral aspiration, whatever it is. So they think that, if they think that Trump is really, really bad for American democracy, he's going to be a dictator, they'll do whatever it takes to stop him. Okay. Whereas I think on the right, people actually think that the means are just as important as the ends. Okay, so I think on the right, they won't basically break the rules in order to stop someone they think they're going to break the rule. You see what I'm saying? And I think that is where the difference is. And I think from that point of view, and this is why, like, where I come in, because I mean, this is why I think the left, okay, is prepared to destroy democracy in order to protect democracy, okay? Because they somehow think that their values, okay, are somehow, superior to the values of other people. And I think I think that's the most dangerous thing. I think, and this is not just only in the US, this is pretty much everywhere, right? I mean, it's pretty much everywhere. It's as true in Europe, as in the US, Australia, Canada, like literally you turn, that's become, so from that point of view, what worries me more than anything else is the sort of the moral, basically, the moral hatred, okay, that basically the left feels for Trump. And I think, also the left just doesn't understand what populism is about. I mean, people tend to think, because of populism, these guys are like, they're going to like, whatever. If you think about what populism actually means, right? Populism in the old sense means, oh, wow, somebody is basically like running up the budget deficits, getting everybody a tax cut and spending a lot of money. That's what a populist is, in my view, which is basically like opening the opening the bank vault. So basically hand out money in the streets to everybody. You know what? Trump is not like that. Maybe Biden has been like that. There's no doubt. I mean, the way that they've been running up the deficit, there's no question that Democrats are behaving like that much more. So I think, again, people have a sort of like, I think the left doesn't understand Trump. They certainly don't understand Trump supporters. They don't understand that this is about, doing what is sensible. And I think, when Trump says he wants to make America great again, I mean, what does that really mean? I mean, you ask yourself. Certainly, I don't think Trump is thinking about the world as a zero-sum game. Actually, I would argue, like, I've been, working international finance for 30 years. I can tell you, and I live in Israel today, I can tell you, like, when you go outside the US, it's pretty amazing whether anywhere you go. Like, most people will tell you that Trump has been the best American president from the point of view of US foreign policy, by the way. Like, I can tell you there is no question. I mean, certainly this is the case in Israel, but I can tell you in China, and even in some countries in Europe where they're actually, I've got their head essentially screwed on the right way. But I think in general, in Saudi Arabia, I was like in Dubai lately, speaking at one of the biggest capital markets conference in the Middle East. And then people will come up to me afterwards and say, you know what, listen, I mean, Trump is amazing. Like, he's the guy, he's the reason why, like, Middle East has embraced reform, that all these Sunni countries have now basically now have thriving economies and trying to focus on making money, which means actually about improving the quality of life for their citizens. So I would say Trump actually, to me, Trump's Make America Great Again definitely is not detrimental to the rest of the world. In fact, I think Biden has been much worse for the rest of the world because he views the world as basically a zero-sum game. And Trump is not like that. Trump is all about basically bringing about a win-win outcome between America and the rest of the world. And as far as Trump is concerned, Make America Great Again is about making the little guys in America great again, okay? It's not about basically, basically opening access for the big corporate monopolies in America so that they can make more money. It's not about that. That's why Trump, was never popular with big corporate captains on Wall Street. I mean, the Wall Street bankers hated basically Trump. Big S&P 500 companies hated Trump. This is why if you look at actually his campaign donation, for example, in 2020 cycle, he got very little money. I mean, from basically corporate donors. Most of his money came from like small donors, right? So from that point of view, again, I think that's the right thing to do, actually. If populism means that you should be looking after the interests of the little guys who represent 90% of the population, that Make America Great Again is about creating a win-win outcome for America and the rest of the world. You know what? That is as good as it gets, in my view. So what I'm just telling you is that people who don't people on the other side who want to get rid of Trump, want to stop him, so on and so forth, I just don't think they understand. They don't understand economics for sure. I'm not even sure they understand geopolitics. So I think to understand why Trump is good for America and for the world, you actually have to be a pretty smart guy. You need to have at least an IQ of 130, 40, in my view. I mean, because Trump is pretty smart himself. I mean, I've heard him speak on a number of occasions where he Trump can be who he wants you to think he is, okay, by the way. But the point here is that, I think people take what comes out of his mouth much too literally. I think he's a very funny guy. I think in some sense, that's sort of like, he doesn't care. He'll say whatever that comes out of his head, whatever. I think that's actually very refreshing. So from that point of view, I think, it's unfortunate that, the left does not see it this way. But then again, I can also understand the left views Trump as the biggest threat to the left, because the left is supposed to stand for the little guys. So when the little guys are all basically, moving to support Trump, then left becomes like meaningless, by the way. If all the Hispanics basically vote for Trump, I mean, it looks like Trump is going to get at least like 45% Hispanic votes this time. This is for basically blocking the border and all that kind of stuff. Then the left is going to literally take the chair that the left stands on and basically pull it. And that's why they hate him so much. Okay.
Now, on a geopolitical level, it is interesting how Trump was pretty much the only president in a while that didn't get us into another war. And then Biden comes along and you see two more wars there. Your perspective on the conflict in the Israel-Hamas conflict and also the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and how the election plays into both of those. And also, I guess, another one that may be upcoming is the China-Taiwan conflict.
Listen, I think this is the reality, right? Think about this, right? First of all, it's interesting. People say, oh, well, Trump is pro-Russia, well, he's pro-China, whatever. I'll tell you the reality. Trump always understood that Russia and China were the two biggest adversaries for the United States. So therefore, this is the reason why Trump's entire policy was designed to keep the Chinese and the Russians from basically getting into bed together, okay? This is why every time Trump said, oh, well, about Xi Jinping, he'd say, well, Xi Jinping's a great man, he's my best friend. Every time Trump talked about Putin, he said, well, Putin is a great man, he's my best friend. As long as Trump was president, Russia and China kept their distance. And then came basically Biden, okay? In literally less than 3 months, Russia and China signed a 30-year strategic agreement. They become fast friends. And then when your two biggest adversaries decide to join force against you, that is definitely going to give you a run for your money. So I think from that point of view, one thing Trump is, I'm a huge fan of game theory. That's a very important toolkit within, the science that we call economics. Trump is he's a game theory genius. He really I could write a book about how he applies game theory systematically. I would say when it comes to China and Russia, it's what I would call basically divide and rule. He actually did engage in divide and rule. And as long as he was president, the two basically biggest adversary of the US kept their distance, which was good for the US. Okay. Secondly, Trump always said, you remember in 2018, during the whole demonstrations in Hong Kong, protests and so on and so forth, Trump basically said, you know what? And then, the left call on Trump to condemn China, to apply sanctions, this and that. Trump says, you know what? I wasn't elected the president of Hong Kong. I'm basically president of the United States. My interest is to serve the interests of Americans, okay? So from that point of view, he had to do what was best for America and not for the students in Hong Kong. This is why he basically continued, the trade negotiation with China that basically went on through 2018 and 19, and then basically pulled off, probably, in my humble opinion, the most incredible trade deal that two countries signed, okay, in the last 100 years, by the way. I was probably one of the few people in all of America, or on Wall Street for that matter, to have read that 100-page basically trade agreement that's Trump signed with China. But let me tell you, that trade agreement, it was a good agreement, not because it only served U.S. interest, but also served Chinese interest. I can tell you all throughout 2019, I was traveling to China, on business for Bank of America, and in big government offices, corporate buildings, people come up to me and whisper in my ear and say, well, David, you know what? We love Trump because Trump, because to understand why the Chinese love Trump, you have to understand that during the 10 years that Xi Jinping was president in his first and second term, the basically reform momentum completely slowed. So the reformers were struggling, to get going again. And then came Trump, who said, you got to do this and this and this and that, opening up the Chinese economy, opening up basically the Chinese markets for competition and so on and so forth. So the reformers felt like all of a sudden they felt galvanized. They thought that Trump was their best friend. So what I'm telling you, in the end, even going through the ordeal of the trade war that Trump started against China, that in the end, you know what? There was a deal. It was not just basically, okay, fine, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. It was not a war. It was a negotiation, and Trump was a tough negotiator. But the bottom line is that there was a deal. And that deal, in the end, was a win-win for both U.S. and China. What else can you possibly want from basically a deal like this? This is a very good example. So again, this is America's, again, from Trump's perspective, his job is not to become an advocate of democracy around the world. His job is not to defend democracy in Hong Kong or anywhere else, or Taiwan for that matter. I have no doubt. I'm from Taiwan, but I have no doubt Trump will sell Taiwan for a chicken wing, if he thinks that this could actually get him some concessions from China that would serve the interests of the little guys in America. And that's okay. That's what he's elected to do. So I think from that point of view, I think this is why, I think especially we're now going through this transition, moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. The rest of the world is gaining, right? I mean, basically, it used to be the case G7 was like, 65% of GDP. Now the G7 economy is like 35% of GDP. The rest of the world's catching up. You need a president like Trump who's pragmatic, who understands how to basically, essentially get things done in a way that America will be able to hold on to its prosperity for as long as possible. And at the same time, not to basically ruin it for everybody else. And this is why it's very important not to think ideologically, but to think practically. And then in that sense, Trump was probably the first realist in terms of foreign policy as a president of the United States since Richard Nixon.
Now, you mentioned a multipolar world, and maybe if we can take this kind of full circle, we were talking at the beginning of the interview about the economy. How do you see this multipolar world affecting the U.S. economy going forward? And I know there's a lot of questions out there. We talk a lot about the BRICS nations, how it's kind of definitely causing a lot of that division there, more the East versus the West. And also there's a lot of talk about the US dollar being used less nowadays. And you might be a bit skeptical about that. So I know that maybe it's throwing a lot at you, but the big picture of the East versus West, how is it going to impact the US?
I've been a currency guy almost all my life, right? Because I did my PhD in economics at Columbia University in international finance, which is about exchange rates, right? I started my career in International Monetary Fund, basically, and I worked in the Monetary and Exchange Affairs Department. And then I ran currency research for, Barclays Capital, for Bank of America. I know a lot about currency markets. I mean, I'd be very surprised if somebody else out there in the world actually knows more than I do, about the currency market. And I can tell you one thing about the currency market, which is that, the reason why, the US dollar is the reserve currency of choice in the world, one very important reason is because the US economy is not that sensitive to a strong dollar, Because by definition, anybody, any country that wants to basically, that aspires to basically, to topple the US dollar, and then replace the US dollar with their own currency as the reserve currency of the world, they have to be prepared to accept a sharp and a dramatic appreciation of their currency. That's the minimum. by the way. This is a very important point, right? Because to be a reserve currency just means like everybody's going to want to basically buy it. So from that point of view, everybody wants to buy it, that means your currency is going to go up. So therefore, what I'm saying is that any currency that is going to replace the dollar or challenge the dollar has to be prepared. Any country has to be prepared for the currency to go up a lot. But you know of any country right now that wants to see their currency go up a lot? Forget about like 50%. Let's just say even by 10%. I don't know of a single country. Because right now, there's not enough growth to go around. Everybody wants to be able to grow faster than the neighbors. The only way you can grow faster is having a weak currency. Okay? And I think this is a very important point. So therefore, right now I look around the world, I suppose, which country in their right mind wants to basically challenge the US dollar as a reserve currency? I cannot think of a single one. Certainly not the Eurozone. I mean, they're giving that up now. They now decided they want a weak currency. Actually, it's very interesting. In the last 10 years, the Eurozone, which had conceived the euro to challenge the US dollar, they now decided that they don't want a strong euro anymore. They want to have a weak euro, okay? And you think China wants to have a strong currency? Forget it, okay? The Chinese economy is struggling big time. I cannot think of a country that wants to have a strong currency. And the only reason why the US economy can live with a strong currency is because, first of all, guess what? US doesn't export that much. Okay, the US exports like 10% of its GDP versus like 20% for Eurozone and 25% for China, for example, with Japan for that matter. So from that point of view, almost by definition, US imports more than it exports. So a strong dollar actually makes imports cheaper without hurting US exports too much. And this is the reason why the US can live with a strong dollar, okay? And at the same time, US exports tend to be much more technologically focused. So if you think about this, right? I mean, if you're selling, I don't know, Microsoft Office software, you think, like if your currency goes up 10% or 15%, it's going to actually like undercut the demand for Microsoft basically Office software. Like if you're a business, this is like, there's nothing else. You either buy it or you don't buy it. If you don't buy it, you don't have a business, basically. So what I'm saying is that the nature of the US economy is actually the fact that the US dollar is a reserve currency of the world is because of some very unique characteristics of the US economy, which are very, very difficult to replicate. Now, it's true, the US could also ruin it for itself. But then again, that's a different story because I think, US is basically US's own worst enemy. If the US wants to bankrupt the US, they can do that. And this administration has basically shown us that they can do that very quickly in a space of 3 years. They basically brought the countries almost on the verge of a total collapse, okay? So another 4 more years of basically Biden, you know what? I wouldn't bank on the dollar sticking around as the world's reserve currency. But I think the point here is that the problem for the dollar is not coming from outside, it's coming from within.
And what is the problem within, in your view, for the US dollar?
I think, listen, I mean, think about this, right? The US is a republic. All these states, we have blue states and red states. If all of a sudden, the blue states and the red states decide to, basically part way, that will be very, very bad news for the US dollar, right? So anything that basically that creates political friction, political instability, that will be like the worst thing that could happen. That's what I was saying to you before. That's why, this election is going to stress test the safeguards that our founding fathers came up with, okay, to help the system navigate against crisis. The question is that, are these safeguards still resilient enough to basically keep the system going? Because I'm conducting monthly survey in the US as well as many other countries to basically gauge the extent of political polarization, okay? And I can tell you, it's pretty amazing. US is literally off the chart. 50% of Americans believe that the US is either very or extremely divided politically. And 40% of Americans believe that political polarization has gotten so bad that it's starting to threaten political stability in the US, okay? 30% of Americans say they don't trust someone who doesn't share their political beliefs. So from that point of view, and then 60% of Americans don't even trust the election process being transparent or fair. So, democracy is all about trust, right? Because at the end of the day, you go basically cast a vote, you have to believe that others are also playing by the rule, right? Because the whole idea is, even if you lose, you defer to the outcome of the election because, that's the rules that you have agreed to play by when you basically live in a democracy, which is that the majority wins. But if you don't trust other people, other fellow citizens to be playing by the same rules, that is the end of democracy. Then in that situation, you might as well move to an authoritarian regime because democracy is not going to work. Okay, with that basically extent of lack of trust. And this is what I think we're going through right now. I mean, this is why if you look at now they're trying to bankrupt Trump. I mean, it's just unbelievable what's happening. I mean, the fact that, all these reasonable thinking people think it's absolutely fine what they're doing to Trump, and they're all outraged by the assassination of Navalny, and then they all thinking it's normal what the Democrats are trying to do to Trump, trying to just bankrupt him at this point. I mean, I think that it's unbelievable. I mean, actually. I mean, it's just sort of this is what's so dangerous about the situation, that things are so bad, but what's even worse is the fact that people don't even realize how bad it is.
Well, it definitely will be interesting to have you back on to continue to discuss as we see this election play out. But David, we really appreciate your time today. If our viewers are interested in learning more, where can they find you?
Yeah, check me out on David Woo Unbound, on YouTube. I mean, that will be a very good first place to find me. And I put out a video every week, and then my whole entire crusade is trying to basically, throw numbers and facts back into public discourse.
Thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you for having me.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for February 19th through February 26th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 2023 1-ounce silver Britannia at $3.15 over spot with a minimum order of 50. We also have 1-ounce Gold Krugerrand at only $59 over spot. And finally, we're offering 1-ounce Platinum Valcambi Bars at just $69 over spot. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.